South Sudan continues to be one of the deadliest places to be an aid worker. According to analysis done by CARE International on data from the Humanitarian Outcomes Aid Workers Security Database, now 44 aid workers lost their lives globally since the beginning of this year, including 11 in South Sudan, 8 in Afghanistan and 7 in Myanmar. Not only are these three countries among the most dangerous places for aid workers, they're also incredibly challenging places for citizens, with nearly 40 million people facing hunger across these countries. Yesterday marked World Humanitarian Day, an international day dedicated to humanitarian workers and those who've lost their lives working for humanitarian causes. Well, for some reflection on the state of the aid workers, we're now joined by Carine Kaneza Nantulya, who's with Human Rights Watch. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter, for inviting me. Pleasure to be with you all.
All right, let's reflect on World Humanitarian Day, and let's start with the perspective of those that are on the front line, because they are very much on the front line, sometimes the biggest crises on the planet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that a good way of starting this conversation is really to offer our condolences and just say that our hearts go out for those who are the front line, really, in providing necessary, urgent humanitarian aid to hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people whose lives who either can actually lose their lives when that aid is not being provided on time and in the right conditions. The other thing I would like to highlight is that as we are reflecting on this important day, let's also remember that the actions and the operations of these humanitarian workers and organizations have been codified, and they are protected within the broader international human rights and humanitarian framework. Their actions and operations are codified within the Geneva Conventions on international humanitarian law, within the Convention of the International Criminal Court, and national laws as well. So it's important to remember that we're talking about critical actors whose actions and operations are protected by the law and by international regulations.
So the tragedy here is that most times a lot of the people who are causing them harm and injury know full well that these humanitarian workers are there to assist and help those in need.
Exactly, and I think that's the saddest. That's the saddest part of it all, right? It's and we also see a trend and examples. We have examples on the continent. In February, we released a short piece on the fact that attacks on humanitarian aid workers are on the rise in South Sudan. For instance, when an unidentified gunman attacked and robbed 7 staff members of Médecins Sans Frontières, robbed them and forced them to actually relocate into another area. We have Ethiopia, where the lack of humanitarian access and what we call the effective siege has impeded and obstructed the operations of humanitarian aid workers. Let's not forget that the ones that have been killed or sent out of the country as persona non grata, and also the impact of such actions on the victims of these different crises. In 2021, Human Rights Watch released a report on which documented the impact of the lack of healthcare facilities on gender-based violence survivors. So the list goes on and on. And it's, I think I would conclude by saying that really the attacks against humanitarian workers have to be understood within the broader context of impunity and the lack of investigations. We see cycles of impunity repeating themselves over and over again, which actually allow and enable these violations to continue.
And sometimes the perpetrators are states, aren't they?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed, and that is the most difficult challenge that organizations like ourselves and others and other governments, their neighbors, regional institutions like the African Union, human rights institutions like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights have to deal with when governments decide to really weaponize and politicize humanitarian access. What do you, in a context where you have obviously a general lack of political will to put pressure on these governments to not just allow humanitarian access, which should not even be part of a political discussion. That we're talking about people's lives, we're talking about human dignity. But here we are. And I think a good example is some of the peace processes we've seen in Ethiopia, actually, where the allowing food trucks to come, to come in Tigray, in the northern part of the country, has been part of the discussions and the negotiations between warring parties, and that is a dangerous precedent, one would say, and a dynamic that will definitely weaken the global international legal framework.
All right, so we've been talking about humanitarian workers, but I suppose that there's a role for society in general. I'm thinking about the things that I saw in Ukraine and neighboring countries where people open their homes for refugees from the Ukraine crisis. Is there more that we could do as societies and communities to help our fellow human beings?
I think there's a range of things we could do. I think Africans, in terms of opening our hearts and our homes to our neighbors, is part and parcel of what we call our Ubuntu culture, isn't it? You know this, Peter. I grew up in a community where sharing your meal with someone passing by because it was late and because we didn't, that person could not go to wherever they were going in a normal time frame. We would even invite them to spend the night. So that's part of our culture. But I think what is required really right now is for activists and human rights monitors to really raise the alarm. It's for us citizens to go to our governments and call upon them to put pressure on these governments who are using humanitarian access as a political tool. As I said, it's a dangerous trend, and it's a trend we should not allow.
And then we hear stories of 11 people in South Sudan of the 44 killed. That's a quarter of the total casualties in South Sudan. Doesn't this point to massive interventions by those that can, that sit in Addis Ababa and other locations?
I couldn't agree more. We've documented similar incidents in different parts of South Sudan, Jonglei, the Abyei administrative area, Arab states, etc. And we're looking at 1.9 million people in distress and in humanitarian need. And as we are analyzing how dire the situation is, let's also remember that the African Union and a growing number of African governments are talking about really boosting the internal the internal continental trade with a continental free trade agreement that is being step by step being implemented. And that's really part of a growing discussion within the African Union and in different places on the continent. How are we and I think the question we need to ask ourselves is how can the African Union and African leaders plan and envision an Africa that is prosperous, and here I'm alluding to the AU 2063 agenda, that is an Africa that is developing on the way of progress, when we have such a huge number of people who require humanitarian aid. And let's also remember that humanitarian crisis create is also different internal displacements, movements of people across neighboring countries, which obviously add on the burden of the host countries as well. So what I'm trying to say here is that addressing first of all, protecting humanitarian aid workers and providing an enabling environment should be part and parcel of the economic agenda of the African Union. And our hope is just that they see it, and that they see, I think, the growing urgency to really put the peace and security and economic agenda, which they're very good at really articulating and working on, to have humanitarian needs as well as human rights concerns on the front seat in these different deliberations.
Carine, thank you so much. Sadly, we've run out of time, but thank you so much for joining us and sharing a few thoughts about this very important day in the middle of continual need and attention that's required. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. And yes, let's hope that things will improve.
Amen.
Gradually.
Thank you. All right, that's Carine Kaneza Nantulya, who's with the Human Rights Watch, speaking to us today on World Humanitarian Day, which was commemorated yesterday, every year on the 19th of August. And a very sad state of affairs that humanitarian workers are losing their lives in the middle of assisting and helping people.